All right, let's jump right in. We're about to walk through one of the most intense spiritual journeys ever recorded, and we're getting it from the source. This isn't just a story about the Buddha. This is the Buddha's own story of how a prince named Siddhartha became an awakened one. It's all pulled directly from his accounts in the ancient Pali texts, and it all kicks off with a really radical idea.
So, get this. This was the core belief that launched his entire quest. It's completely counterintuitive, isn't it? The idea that to find true lasting happiness, you first have to go through immense, unimaginable suffering. This one single thought set the stage for a 6-year ordeal that pushed the absolute limits of human endurance.
You know, before he was the Buddha, he was just a young man who saw the suffering baked into life and felt he had to find a way out. So he left everything, his palace, his family, and, as the texts tell it, his weeping parents, totally convinced that the only path to real freedom was through denying the body absolutely everything.
And he didn't just wander around aimlessly. No, he sought out the most famous meditation teachers of his day. First up was Alara Kalama, who taught how to get into this state of pure emptiness called the sphere of nothingness. Siddhartha mastered it, like instantly. So we moved on to Uddaka Ramaputta, who taught an even more subtle state, one that's beyond both perceiving and not perceiving. And you guessed it, he mastered that in no time too.
Both of these teachers were so blown away, they actually asked him to take over their schools. But he had this profound realization. He knew deep down that even these incredible mental states weren't the final answer. They were just temporary fixes, and they didn't lead to that true unshakable liberation he was looking for. So he said thanks, but no thanks, and walked away, alone, to keep searching.
So having hit the limits of what the mind could do, he turned his full, intense focus onto the body. And this kicked off a 6-year period of extreme self-mortification. He basically decided to conquer suffering by inflicting the most suffering he possibly could on himself.
To really, truly get what was going on during this 6-year ordeal, we have to look at one key word from the Pali language, padana. Now, it usually gets translated as striving or struggle, but its real meaning, what you find when you look at its linguistic roots, unlocks the whole story.
Okay, so let's do a little linguistic detective work here, a practice called niruti. We break the word down. You have pa, which means forward, and da, which means to place or to set. So padana isn't just generic struggling. It's a very precise, focused placing forward of energy. It's about the conscious application of your will. The real question isn't if you're trying hard, but what you're aiming all that effort at.
And boom, there it is. This is what illustrates his fundamental mistake. The man had incredible energy, an unbreakable will, and relentless focus. But he was aiming it all at the wrong target. He was placing forward every ounce of his effort into punishing his body, thinking that by crushing it, he could somehow set his spirit free.
And he described his methods with brutal honesty. First, he tried to just dominate his mind through sheer willpower. He'd clench his teeth and literally crush any thought that popped up. The effort was so intense, he said, that sweat would pour from his armpits.
When that didn't work, he turned to his breath. He started holding it for so long that the pressure inside his head built up into this violent roar, which he compared to the sound of a blacksmith's bellows.
The side effects were, as you can imagine, agonizing. He described the pain as feeling like a strong man was literally splitting his skull open with a sharp sword.
All this intense internal friction generated so much heat that his entire body felt like it was on fire. His analogy, it was like being roasted alive over a pit of hot coals.
And then finally, he took on the most extreme fast you can imagine, cutting his food down to almost nothing. The results were just devastating. His body completely wasted away. He became a living skeleton, so thin that he could touch his stomach and literally feel his own spine.
So here's the bottom line. After 6 years of the most intense mental and physical struggle imaginable, pushing himself further than anyone else, he just collapsed. He'd reached the absolute limit of self-torture and realized it hadn't gotten him 1 inch closer to the truth. It was a total dead end. But that moment of complete and utter failure, that was his greatest turning point.
Lying there, on the brink of death, a memory from his childhood just floated up. He remembered sitting under a tree while his dad was working, and how he just spontaneously slipped into this deep, pleasant, and focused state of meditation. It was totally effortless. It was blissful. And it had nothing to do with pain, but it also had nothing to do with chasing sensual pleasure.
This memory forced him to rethink everything, especially his whole idea of sukha,
or happiness. And just like with padahana, the usual translation of pleasure or bliss is only half the picture. The real meaning, the root of the word, is this brilliant, physical, almost mechanical metaphor.
So using that same linguistic lens, let's break this one down too. Su means good, and ka can mean space, but in this context it refers to the axle hole of a chariot wheel. So sukha literally means having a good axle hole, which gives you a smooth, comfortable ride. And its opposite dukkha, what we call suffering, means having a bad, wobbly, off-center axle hole. That gives you a bumpy, jarring, awful ride. So happiness isn't just a feeling, it's a state of being perfectly aligned and functioning smoothly.
This brought him to the life-changing question: why am I so afraid of a pleasure that has nothing to do with sensual desires? He realized he'd been lumping all sukha, all pleasure together as the enemy. But now he saw the crucial difference. There's the jarring, fleeting pleasure you get from the senses, sure, but there's also this smooth, well-centered pleasure that comes from a focused mind. This wholesome kind of happiness wasn't an obstacle to awakening, it was the path itself.
And that single insight, it basically changed the course of human history. He immediately gave up the path of pain. He accepted a simple meal to get his strength back, and from then on he would forge a new path, a middle way, right between the extremes of indulgence and self-torture.
But this decision came at a price. His 5 friends, the ascetics who had been practicing with him, were completely horrified. They saw him eating and just figured he'd given up, that he'd failed. They called him a quitter and abandoned him. But now, truly and completely alone, he sat down, nurtured that wholesome, blissful state he remembered from his childhood, and finally, he did it. He achieved full awakening.
But right after reaching the ultimate goal, a moment of doubt crept in. He thought to himself, what I've found is just too deep, it's too subtle. A world obsessed with pleasure is never going to get it. And for a second, he seriously considered just living out his life in solitude, and not even trying to teach it to anyone. Well, the ancient story tells us a celestial being, a Brahma, appeared right then and pleaded with him not to keep this knowledge from the world. So the Buddha looked out at humanity with his new, enlightened vision, and he saw people like lotuses in a pond. Yeah, many were stuck deep in the mud of ignorance, but some were rising up towards the surface, and a few were right there at the top, just waiting for the sun, ready to bloom. And it was for their sake that he agreed to teach.
So, who would be his first students? His first act of compassion wasn't to go to kings or famous priests. It was to find the 5 friends who had totally misunderstood him, the ones who had left him in disgust. He knew they had the dedication, they were just pointed in the wrong direction. So he set out to find them and share the real path.
And that's the story, straight from the source. It really leaves us with a powerful question for our own lives. The Buddha's great padhana, his incredible effort, only worked once he aimed it correctly, away from pain and towards a balanced, wholesome well-being. It makes you ask, doesn't it? In our own lives, our careers, our relationships, our goals, where are we just struggling for the sake of struggling, and where are we actually creating a smooth ride forward?